This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. And I love this. Go take care of yourself by going to betterhelp.com/PWNA.
And then the following week, last week, we were talking about Lot. And we were talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. And we were talking about how Lot chose to go pinch his tits. Excuse me. Pitch his tents. Pitch his tents is what I said. And you heard nothing else here. This is church, my gosh. So he was pitching his tents close to Sodom and Gomorrah. And so what happened was, when he did that, he was getting too close to evil. And what I was challenging you guys to not do was to pick friends that were going to lead you to, man, stop laughing. All right? Man, am I red right now? Holy cow. Allie, I hope this isn't on videotape, because I have no job now.
Hey, I'm hesitant to even, I'm even hesitant to say it. Is tits, is that offensive? Like, just in passing?
I think that teats is the technical term. So I think tits is like a little bit more inappropriate because I think tits is like porn women and teats is like, you milk a teat.
Yeah. See, it's funny because I don't want to say it anymore. T-I-T. It's so funny, like, and it's one of those joking around that I like to say that word in front of Priscilla because the joke is making fun of like Southern redneck guys that just say that. And what I think is even a funnier word is T-I-T-I-E-S.
Oh yeah, or specifically, dem titties.
I mean, you don't.
I'm still nursing. So this is not like when I think about boobs, all I think about is milk bags.
Yeah.
So sometimes I will offer to my 18-month-old son, would you like them titties? Which I should probably stop doing at some point.
Oh my gosh. All right. So I want to tell our listeners some episodes that are upcoming. And then I want to tell you something I think is going to blow your mind. It blew my mind. But check this out, Ellen. First of all, you already know that you and Jack are going to have to deal with pissed off Chip Judd about y'all's assessment of speaking in tongues. He's not pissed, but it's going to be great because I think he was irritated by what he heard. And again, him and Jack are buds. He's not the kind that's going to get on here and be like super mad, but he's like a caged lion right now. It's going to be fun.
Well, hopefully he's more irritated at Jack because he knows him and he just thinks I'm some raging liberal.
Right. Right. So we're going to have an episode basically on sex and erotica by this Erica Smith. She started Purity Culture Dropout. I had just heard of this. I was like, wow, that's right up my alley. And
mine.
Yep. So there's a girl, I've already done this interview, a woman who has had the craziest panic attacks that I've ever heard. And so we have a whole episode on panic attacks. And then every Christmas, what do you think about this? I just think I don't know. I don't think neat is the right word, but every Christmas, instead of having like a bubblegum and roses Christmas episode, I like to talk to someone who had experienced something tragic. And so there's a friend of ours, her mom got killed in a car wreck on Christmas freaking Day. So that's crazy. She's going to come on here and talk about that. Is that messed up? Is that messed up that I do sad stuff like that?
No, and my friend found his mom dead last year on Christmas Eve.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah. And this plant you see behind me?
Yeah.
Is hers, and I'm like propagating it and giving it to other people so that she can live on.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's an evolutionist who's going to come on, and he also believes in Adam and Eve, which I think is crazy. So an evolutionist that also believes in literal Adam and Eve.
So we can just call ourselves anything.
What's that?
We can just call ourselves anything now.
What do you mean?
Well, if he's an evolutionist and he believes in Adam and Eve, we're just kind of picking and choosing.
Oh, sure. I'm a creationist. Yeah, something like that. So probably the episode that I'm looking forward to the most because where are you at with afterlife stuff? You're not on the universalism bandwagon, are you? I'm on that bandwagon, but it's not something. Go ahead,
Joey. I think I've teetered over to the dark side.
Yeah.
No hell for me, I think.
So Pastor Chip Judd, a lot of people like that guy. He comes on here a lot. He actually told me, he's like, look, I like conversations like this. I like the disagreements. He said, but one thing that I've noticed about all Christian Universalists is they devalue the cross and they devalue Jesus's divinity. So there is a woman, I think her name is Sharon Baker. I talked to her on the phone. She wrote a book called Raising Hell, and she believes in a divine savior, and she believes that the cross was necessary. So I'm going to try to get Chip to be Universalist.
Yeah, I think you could, because the only thing that was keeping me from Universalism was the cross, which is why I had such a big problem with Rob Bell for so long.
Yeah.
Not just because Mark Driscoll is in my ear about it.
Yeah.
But I can't articulate it now because I'm not a theologian, but I've heard that there's a way around it. You can still believe that the cross was necessary and also refuse the idea of eternal torment. Yeah. So whatever that is, that's what I am.
Yep. All right. So check this out. You've heard of Jesus and John Wayne, the book, right?
Yes.
So Kristen Kobus Dumais, she's the interview on this episode, and I found out about her and her book. I think I found out on the rise and fall of Mars Hill, but we've already done this interview that we're about to air. And when I did this interview, it was before I heard something shocking at a Christian conference that I was basically required to volunteer at, which is great. It's, fun and all that. But check this out. This woman is up on stage with a bunch of other pastors' wives, and she literally is talking about a different woman. She's just describing like a friend of hers, and she says, she's a real strong woman, but then she pauses and says, in a healthy way. And I was like, oh
Gross.
My gosh, like that is still very prevalent. I mean, that was a huge conference, and she had to make, real quick, strong in a healthy way. Like, what does that even mean? There's good strength and bad strength.
Well, sure. Because, because in her mind, a strong woman is like basically like a very forceful, ugly lesbian.
Right. Yep.
God.
Yep, for sure. That's crazy.
Oh, it's so bad.
Yep, and that's what y'all got. You guys at Mars Hill were spoon-fed for sure for a very long time.
Yeah.
Well, before we hear from Dumais, we got John Mark McMillan and Jory Micah. It's actually recorded a year ago, but because the woke culture is still kicking ass and taking names and they're bullying people in their big bully tribe, I wanted to re-air this little assessment. It's a loving assessment of our dear brothers and sisters in the woke culture.
I even had a thing the other day where two people got in a heated debate on my Instagram, a heated debate, and they were going back and forth, and I'm trying very hard to be a grown-up. I had strong opinions about both, and I posted something that was to the point but was very kind, and I had both of them separately DM'd me and apologized for the way they acted on my Instagram. But I was very tempted to go for the jugular because I felt like I could have.
Yeah.
But I didn't. And I'm really glad I didn't, because that would not have made an impact. I would have gotten back what I put out, which is like outrage versus outrage versus outrage. And I was honest and kind. I was giving and I spoke my mind. And they both came to me individually and apologized. Two separate sides of one issue.
Yeah, like Jory, I'm thinking of your situation and how much more productive would it have been if you had someone reach out to you personally and just say, hey, look, I understand that you were doing the best that you could and maybe you weren't thinking this, but I just want to let you know it's at least off-putting to me personally that you didn't have someone of color, but not someone like, imagine that. Imagine someone going to you directly out of kindness and out of sincere care for you, or sincere convictions they feel that they need to tell you, but instead of blasting you publicly, actually going to you in a very humble, gentle way. Like, what happened to that?
Right. To be honest, like, I don't even associate with those people anymore. Like, I mean, if they are progressive or ex-evangelicals that are cool, I associate with the cool people. But if they're, I don't want to be around a bunch of bullies.
Right.
And
right.
social, like, I love social justice, but I haven't always fit in with the social justice crowd.
Yep. I'm with you. I mean, I think some great examples out there that I've seen recently. Kat Armis, Jay Baker.
Oh yeah.
Jason Petty, who's propaganda. I mean, just the stuff that they've been tweeting and saying, especially about this whole ordeal on Twitter recently. I'm just like, yeah, I'm with you. It's just because here's the thing is there's really no point in interacting with that crowd unless you are willing to be exactly like them in everything they do and say. And you know what? I don't want to. I don't agree with everything. And that right there puts me on the outskirts. And so I don't really even have a choice. I'm not going to be welcomed into them, if I wanted to. With a lot of the disdain that those folks have are very legitimate, very well founded. A lot of them came from like super unhealthy forms of evangelicalism and fundamentalism, and then you just look right now and you see churches dodging the requirements to shut down. Trump is awesome. COVID-19 sent by God. Gays are the worst, and it's like, okay, I get that. My question I've been thinking through is how do people, like, how does Joey Svensson here, how do I make a distinction between me and that without being arrogant and prideful myself? Like, in other words, I want people to know, hey, I'm not this guy that gives Trump a thumbs up. I didn't vote for Trump. I think he's not a good person. I don't think he is respectful to women. He is not God's choice of president. I'm not homophobic. I don't think COVID-19 is sent by God. How do I have a distinction there? But I don't want to be a part of that crowd. But isn't that also me saying I'm better than all them? And why is the bad stuff about me and my shortcomings and my weakness less severe than them with how you know what I'm saying? I'm having a hard time with the tension of, I don't want to be seen in that camp. And at the same time, I'm not better than them either.
Are you talking about the Trump camp?
Yes. I'm no better than those people. I'm just not. I think, Paul even tells us in Philippians, consider other people as better than yourselves. So I don't want, like, and I think for the most part, people don't see me in that camp. Thank God. But I don't want to be lumped in with that. But how, that's my question is, how do you take that position without also being arrogant and thinking that you're better than them?
Right. I see what you're saying. Do you want to say, John?
Sure. So just in general, like, and I try to do this now. This is not a thing I did when I was younger, but I try when I really heavily disagree with somebody, I try for a minute in my mind before I respond to them to think about why they might feel the way they do. And I try in my opening to try and acknowledge that they may have a good reason for kind of believing what they believe, because certainly they think they have a good reason, and so trying to acknowledge something good in what they're saying, even if they're askew, so like, I know a lot of people I consider to be really good people who voted for Trump. I didn't vote for Trump. I'm not a Trump fan. I know some really good people. Most of them are not like pumped on Trump, but they did vote for him. But I know a few who are, and they're
I'm with you.
Good people. Generally speaking, they're good people. And so, like, I would got to imagine there's got to be a reason they feel the way they feel. And usually people will step into an idea based on one thing, and then they'll just sort of bring the baggage of the rest, like whether it would be like the abortion issue. I have several friends who are like, I can't stand Trump. I don't like Trump, but we got to get new people in the Supreme Court and
Supreme Court.
And, yeah. And they generally believe that, like, I don't think they were excited about Trump. And then I think because there was such an outcry against Trump and then against them, then they sort of like, all right, well, then I'm going to tribe up now. Then I'm going to tribe up and I'm going to take all of it. And they're going to take on all the beliefs that they really didn't step into the door before. You know what I'm saying? It's not what got them in the door. They got in the door in a genuine way. So I try and acknowledge that, right? And then I try and offer why I would disagree with them without demeaning them as a person. For instance, this argument I got into the other day on Facebook. This lady got mad because I said hell in my post, and it's like, well, you don't know me very well. That's what offended you, but and I tried to, but then, and a lot of people defended me, and one girl was defending me. She was being very cruel, and she ended up calling the lady who, this lady wasn't actually mean in her post. I disagreed with her, but she wasn't actually being mean. And one of the girls who was defending me, she ended up calling the lady a Karen. And I was like, why does that bother me? She's defending me. I was like, why does this bother me? I started asking myself why it bothers me. And I realized it bothers me because it's nowhere on par with a racial slur. It's nowhere on par with that. But it is in the same spirit when you create a category to categorically dismiss a human being based on something they may or may not be able to fully control.
My mother voted for Trump, and my big sister, actually, she could care less about politics, but she was dating a major Trump supporter while he was running. So you got me on Facebook like, hell no to Trump, and then you got my sister on Facebook who's more theatrical than I am, way more theatrical than I am, basically Trump 2016, Trump everything, selling the t-shirts and everything. So I've had to kind of remain humble to have any sort of conversations with my mom. My sister doesn't really care, so I don't talk to her. But my mom and I, we've gotten a lot of, I barely spoke to her for 6 months after Trump won, because I was so devastated that he won and that my family were in support of him, who taught me to be different than that. And so I was so devastated, I barely spoke to her. But as we started coming to healing that relationship, we started listening to each other a little better. And that's kind of where I'm at now, where I'm just like, man, we're never going to get anywhere if we don't start listening to the other side. I think at the end of the day, we probably agree on a lot more than we disagree on. It's just that everybody's so polarized and hyper focused on the things they disagree on that we don't talk to people with what they do agree on anymore. We don't find common ground. And I think that's what we're missing here, is like, we have to be people, especially if we're followers of Christ, that find common ground with others, and that's where we start, and be better listeners. And also, don't be afraid to say how you feel too, like, because if you're anything like me, I'll just hold it down, and then explode. So don't, let people. I think we need to start having these conversations with Trump supporters, and it's hard because it feels like you can't reason with a lot of them. But there are a lot that are very good people, like you said. They're not bad people. They're just somehow got caught up. And I talked to my mom about this with the Christian thing too. She says, for many years, Christians have felt ignored. Evangelical Christians have felt ignored. They felt like bulldozed over, basically. Things they don't believe in. They don't believe in abortion. They don't believe in gay rights. They might be okay with gay rights, but they don't believe in, that it can be considered not a sin. Like those are their convictions. And so they feel like those convictions have been bulldozed over so much, and this world has become liberal in their opinion so quickly. And I think that is why a lot of the white evangelicals went for Trump, because he gave them more attention and a voice than Democrats ever did. So
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, you can't blame them, even though
he wasn't a threat
sold
to them.
out. Right. Even though we look at it as, you sold out, I just did that. You're a sellout, on their end of things, they think, wow, someone's finally listening to me. Someone finally cared. Like, even if he's a terrible person, at least he cares about what I care about. That's kind of how they look at it, I think.
Yeah. Yep, for sure. Well, I tell you what, if that army that you were talking about, Jory, listens to this episode, they're coming after us. So
I know. You know what? I've been thinking about that the whole time in the back of my head. Like, oh my gosh, I am in so much trouble.
I actually do think they represent a lot less people than what we would ever imagine. I really do.
They are scary, though.
All right, many of you have heard of the book Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Some of you have heard the author, Kristen Kobus-Dumais, on the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. She's a historian. I really enjoy history. I really enjoy this conversation. We're going to drop right into it. She had just taught me how to say her name, and I just caught her up on me and Priscilla's evangelical upbringings, including being avid followers of Mark Driscoll. I call ourselves, we used to be Driscollites. And we had the best intentions, and we tried to do the whole wife submit to husband route thing, and it just didn't work out too well for us. Come to find out, I'm only the smartest and strongest half of the time, if that. Here you go, guys. I think as somewhat of a foundation, and I don't know if this is a weird question or not, but like, where do you stand when it comes to male and female differences? Because I know there's some people on one end of the spectrum, they're just like totally fluid. There's nothing male, there's nothing female. We made that up.
Yeah.
Like, I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah. So, I'm a historian by training, and I tend to approach this question as a historian. And so in this field, the social construction of gender is very much a thing. And in fact, I was just teaching on this yesterday in my women's history class, that as a historian, when you look across time and across different cultures, right, it's very much in your face that the ways in which different peoples and different moments and different contexts understand what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, changes dramatically over time and space, which isn't to say that there is nothing biological, right? That it's not an either or at all, that there are biological differences between men and women. We can talk about, at the cellular level, you can talk about, all sorts of really interesting scientific conversations.
I mean, just even testosterone and estrogen.
Estrogen, yes.
Estrogen,
yeah.
Estrogen. Ostrich, ostriches have the estrogen.
Right.
Estrogen that you guys have.
Spectrum. So, there are absolutely differences, but then, in human societies, what do we do with those differences? What do we think is the ideal man, the ideal woman? And then, as religious beings, what do we think, God ordained this or that? So there are biological differences, there's social meaning, and there's religious meaning. But I would also say that I would push back against this really harsh kind of binary, that there's masculine and there's feminine. And scientifically too, that doesn't hold up. There is a spectrum that we're looking at, and also that people who tend to hold up that binary tend to see the two as opposites, right? So this goes in this basket, this goes in this, and I would absolutely say that would be a distortion of created reality.
So I was thinking through. In fact, we did kind of an analysis episode with Tony Jones, who was on the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and kind of talked about episode 1 of that. And one thing, and we're going to do a follow up, and I've been taking notes. One thing that I'm curious, it's, I think they said something along the lines of Mark Driscoll. This is what happens when you take the Bible and you make it, you like accommodate it to you, and you use it however you see fit. I struggle with that. Like, I think that, and I'm probably wrong, and this is what I want to hear from you, is it just seems like Mark Driscoll, that's the result of taking the Bible inerrantly. The passage basically where a man reflects God's glory and a woman reflects man's glory. So it just seems like all the toxic stuff at Mars Hill, for instance, was a result of them taking the Bible and applying it in a way that we're not supposed to apply. Like, is that a fair assessment? I mean, because the Bible seems to be very much so male-centric, headship, submission and all of that.
Well, I think that you'd have to add the word selectively there too, right? Because there are a lot of Bible passages that they are not taking literally at all. And so, first of all, we could look at the history of biblical interpretation, and there's a long history. This is not just a recent thing of very different ways to interpret some of those key texts that I think you have in mind. But more than that, I mean, if you think about the scriptures, you think about the words of Christ, you think about the model of Jesus that we are called to follow. That is a model that women and men are called to follow. When you think about something like, let's look at the Beatitudes. Let's look at the fruit of the Spirit. Just think about that: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. These are for men too. Right. And the call to take up your cross and follow, that's for women and for men alike. And when you think about it that way, I think that conservative evangelicals have really tended to focus on difference and then impose difference on the scriptures when, the vast majority of biblical texts, in as much as they apply to us today, apply to women and men alike. And that really gets lost in these conversations. So I think that there is, not just in Driscoll's case, but in conservative evangelicalism more generally, a tendency to be extremely selective in which passages they take literally and in which ones they just write off or, turn the other cheek. Love your enemy. These sorts of things, I come across in this literature on Christian masculinity. They literally say, yeah, no, that doesn't apply. You can't teach a boy to become a man by teaching him to turn the other cheek, right? So huge caveat there.
Yeah, for sure. So here's one that troubles me, and let me ask you before I tell you what I think of it. Why 12? Why 12 male apostles?
Yeah,
that's the one that trips me up a little bit. My thought is potentially, let's just say someone like Mary Magdalene eventually was on the same level as those 12 guys, but culturally, you just don't write that down. You've got 12 men. You're not gonna add any women to it. But what do you do with that as far as 12 picks and not one woman? That's just kind of weird,
As a historian who studies the history of biblical interpretation, it's humbling, right? Because I can find, and I have found, interpretations historically going back hundreds of years that I think are right, that I really like, but I can also find ones that I find abhorrent, right? And so, I try to be really honest as a historian and not just cherry pick the, biblical interpretations that I tend to be drawn to and say, aha, everybody should believe it this way. As a historian, I have to hold up both. And then you start asking the questions, why in this moment was this interpretation so compelling? What was this doing for people? And which isn't to say that I'm not trying to figure out the truth. I think all of us Christians are ultimately, hoping that our faith is most closely aligned to actual truth. But it's just really humbling, right? To keep in mind that I could be wrong here. So in that case, I actually, that's funny. I don't even think about that or hear that so much. The 12 disciples, as much as I look at the way Jesus seemed to upend human expectations over and over again. Look at the men that he did select. Look at his interactions with women. Look at the role of women in that very early Christian church. And even looking to the Old Testament too. Look at the role of women at a time when society was just rigidly patriarchal. And so I guess, and this is also the circles that I've found myself in, particularly women's biblical interpretation, those instances really come to the fore much more than those 12 disciples who, if you look at them, they weren't all that great. They screwed up all the time.
Right.
Precisely because their
point.
expectations were not aligned. Their understanding of Jesus and what he came to do, who he was, their understanding of power and their role in that, right? That's where they screwed up over and over again. And so I just think that there's a whole lot more even to the 12 disciples than 12 men, case closed.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so the bullseye question. You look at Wild at Heart, you look at Mark Driscoll, you look at the Harley Davidson Men's Ministry.
Yes.
How did we get there? I mean, how in the world did we get here? And with that question, maybe we can treat them as two different questions. But before logging on with you setting up my stuff, I'm listening to Tupac in my headphones, and I'm like, is this just a church thing? I love Tupac. I think he has a lot of great truth, but there's also a lot of womanizing, obviously. So it's just like, was it just the church or was it culture as a whole?
Yeah.
But that's probably two separate questions.
No, it's a yes, both, right?
Yeah.
So I happen to be a historian of American religion with a focus on white evangelicalism, and so that's what I write about and that's what I speak about. But by no means are evangelicals the only ones who have embraced patriarchy, who have problematic views of sexuality, of gender, and things like that. That just happens to be my focus. But this relationship to culture is really important to point out, because I think evangelicals themselves tend to deny the influence of culture on their own values, right? No, this is biblical. This is just biblical. Yeah. And, culture is what is going on out there. And then we here, we're biblical. We have truth. And this is certainly the rhetoric that I grew up with. And as a cultural historian, it's just really obvious to me, again, to see kind of the change over time. Where did this come from?
All right, so this podcast has a new sponsor, BetterHelp. You guys have heard my story. If not, hey, I'll put some links in the show notes because I've been telling my story. And part of my story is the role my therapist has played in my life. Her name is Jackie. So for you Star Wars fans, I call her Obi-Wan Kajaki. And let me tell you this, that therapy with her literally saved my life. And that's why I am very proud of our new sponsor for this podcast. So think about it. Without a healthy mind, being like happy and at peace is hard, man. But the good news is I'm a living example of how therapy works. And it's crazy. I've had even pastors come up to me and say, hey, what goes on in a therapy session? What's therapy? Well, it's whatever you want it to be. Maybe you're not feeling motivated at the moment and would like tools to help. Or maybe you're feeling insecure in relationships or at work. You're not dealing with stress. So whatever you need, it's really time to stop being ashamed of normal human struggles and just go try to feel better, because you just got one life, man. So you deserve to be happy for this life. If it's out there, go grab it. And so now you don't have to worry about finding an in-person therapy near you to help, which saves tons of time because we're all so busy, man. You live in a crowded city. You've got like a therapy appointment that's 50 minutes to an hour, but you got the drive time there and back. And golly, that can be a huge time commitment, but not with BetterHelp. You can do that at the comfort of your own home, receiving therapy sitting on your couch. And it's also customized online therapy with video, phone, and live chat sessions options. And so you don't have to even be seen on the camera if you don't want to. And what's crazy is all of this is more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can start communicating with a therapist within 48 hours. And this is insanely awesome, y'all, because depending on where you live, this 48-hour thing is a lifesaver. When I had my mental health crisis, my dear wife was trying like anything to get me in to see a therapist, and they were all booked for a month. And I needed help right then and now. So join the millions of people who are seeing what online therapy is all about. It's always good to invest in yourself because you are your greatest asset when it comes to your mental health. So here's the deal. The podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp, and listeners of Pastor With No Answers get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/PWNA. I love this. Go take care of yourself. That's betterhelp.com/PWNA.
You can look back to the 19th century and see that in the 19th century, a lot of American Christians upheld a very different ideal of masculinity, one of gentlemanly restraint, self-control, more of a Victorian middle class, upper class kind of model. You could see in the early 20th century, a lot of conservative Protestants who rejected Christian nationalism, who embraced pacifism, right? And these are really important to keep in mind because that makes us understand that where we are now, this was not inevitable. And this is not the inevitable outworking of biblical teachings, right? So that's where we have to look at what else was going on. And in the mid-century, when evangelicals kind of came together to regroup, feeling like they lost some power, in the wake of the Scopes trial, early 20th century fundamentalist modernist controversy, they wanted to reassert their influence on American society, and they wanted to be, the most faithful Christians, which they believed they were, and they wanted to defend Christian America because they thought they had this special role to play. And this was during the 1940s, World War II, right into the early Cold War. So defending faith, family, and nation was central to their values, and it was a military defense that was necessary in that moment. And so all of these things came together where they believed that God had ordained men, especially Christian men, to be the protectors, to protect faith, family, and nation, right? And it required a ruthless defense. In fact, it required a ruthless offense to do this, both in terms of domestic politics, in terms of Christianity and orthodoxy, and also in terms of foreign policy. And you can just see this take shape. And what happened then is in the 1940s and 1950s, these values, kind of family values, gender traditionalism, Cold War militarism, were not so out of step with other Americans. This was the baby boom. This was consensus era. It's in the 1960s when a lot of Americans started questioning these values. You have the civil rights movement, is America so great and good? You have Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, you have the feminist movement. And that's when evangelicals really double down on these and they become oppositional values and they feel like they're losing ground. And so they really have to fight to defend.
Gosh, we're talking 60 years ago. This is when it started to really take shape.
Absolutely. That's when we have the emergence of somebody like James Dobson in the early 70s. And you have the rise of the religious right. And we are still very much living in that moment today.
So, you're the authority on this. This is not a challenge as much as it's just me trying to figure this out. So before my grandpa had passed away, 15 years prior, so they're born in the teens. But when I go over to grandma's house, she's a sweet, sweet, sweet woman, but I'm there. She serves me. And I would always resist it, but she's like, sit down in your grandpa's seat. Can I get you some coffee? Would you like some eggs? And part of that is just she's my grandma and she loves me, but I'm also the male. She doesn't treat my wife that way. So it just seems to be that was our culture growing up.
Yeah.
It seems like that's how it was in the 1800s, but I'm not a historian. Yeah. So I don't know. So just with that as context, how was it really taking form in the 60s and not already in place? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And so, in fact, what we see happening in the 1950s, this resurgence of family values and, traditional gender roles, traditional in air quotes, it does harken back to the 19th century, to these Victorian roles. But if you want to go back a little further than that, say to the 17th century, to colonial America, you definitely have distinct gender roles. But very different ones in some ways, right? Where women are valued very differently, not as kind of ornamental and not as sentimental, but as hard workers, because this was a subsistence era, right? They needed, there was nothing delicate about colonial womanhood at all, right? So again, as a historian, you just keep tracing change over time, and you see how these values made a lot of sense. Right? Victorian values made a lot of sense in an industrialized economy, when all of a sudden men were leaving the house, they were going out to work, women were staying in the home. There were questions of, in a new capitalist economy, where does our social virtue lie? Well, if men are out, fighting each other to make money, that's not where you're going to find social virtue. In the home, where it's private and lovely, that's where we can have our social virtue, right? There's a long history here, hundreds of books written on this. And so when you jump up to the 1950s, that was also a very unusual time in American history, right? Post-war era, you have the federal government subsidizing this kind of nuclear family ideal, home loans, the GI Bill. But this was also not a kind of universal standard of living. This was very much, it was a white middle class thing. So that's another thing I'd point out. We really should talk about race and class here, because what white evangelicals have held up as, God ordained gender roles really has only ever applied to a small number of even just Americans, even in that historical moment. And yet, think of the what that does when this is held up as, this is biblical manhood, biblical womanhood. And then even by the 1970s, that was increasingly difficult. This male breadwinner society economy was falling apart. So then what you have is a lot of men and women being told, you have to live up to this ideal. This is godly family life, but the economy is structured in a way that it's impossible to do so.
Yeah, gosh. It's interesting because I have a hard time, because I understand evangelicals so well, I have a hard time being angry, but that's probably a lot to do with my privilege. But what makes things so jacked up is all of this stuff that even evangelical women would disagree with you about, it's tied in with their holiness.
Yes.
Like, it's like, this is how, like, there's very good intentions there. It's like, hey, we got to go the opposite way of the world.
Yes.
I mean, an example of this. So I talked to tons of people, rubbed shoulders with tons of people. And there was, so take that. This is crazy. There's a woman, she's in her mid 30s. She's running like 2 businesses, unbelievable artist. I mean, just an amazing woman. I talked to this woman's mom, and her mom said, I'm praying for a leader in her life. Like, she just needs to be led. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? Needs to be led. Like, it's just, and that was coming from a sincere mother's heart.
Yes. Oh, there's so much sincerity here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And people are earnestly trying to live faithfully. But they are being shaped, right, discipled by a whole culture industry, essentially, right? One of the things that I do in Jesus and John Wayne is I take popular culture seriously. Christian radio, Christian television, Christian publishing, these devotionals, the how to be a Christian man, how to be a Christian wife, how to raise your kids. This is, if you're in evangelical spaces, what I'm talking about. For people outside of evangelical spaces, they're entirely oblivious to this entire subculture, this entire world, really, right? And so there are many, many people who are earnestly trying to do God's will in their lives, and they are being told, this is how you do it. And I've talked to so many women and men. I mean, since this book has come out, it's been out for a year now. I get several letters a day to this day from evangelicals or former evangelicals telling me the story of their lives, telling me how their lives mapped onto the narrative that I describe in Jesus and John Wayne. And these are incredibly poignant letters. And they are, so many men and women say, I thought I was doing what was right. I absolutely embraced this. I was trying to be a good wife. I was trying to be obedient. It was, and I want those 20, 30 years back, right? The choices that I made, the harm that was done to me, to others. And so it really is devastating, but certainly there were many good intentions. And what drew people into this was really being discipled and told, this is what it means to be Christian.
Obviously, your work is so important, and you're speaking to tons of people who you're just kind of jolting them like, whoa, I thought this was the way to go. Over time, it seems like this is going to work itself out. And obviously, that's not soon enough. And I don't mean to sound crass, but eventually, the older folks are going to die. And it just seems like the vast majority of youngsters growing up, they're not going to stand for this sort of approach to Christianity.
Yeah. So it's hard to know how to answer that, because to be honest, I've been hearing that theory for more than 20 years now.
Oh, wow. It's not original? Dang
that
it.
The older, they're dying out, the demographic change. And the problem is that younger evangelicals grow up to be older evangelicals, or younger evangelicals, right, who can't stomach this, leave evangelicalism. And that leaves, the communities, more radicalized often. And we see that happening even, a lot of older evangelicals right now saying, I can't do this anymore. They try to change their church, their, organization or institution, and finally like, enough. And then they leave. So you've got, the Beth Moores, the Russell Moores, but you have this happening all across evangelicalism in local spaces as well. So I guess I'm a little less optimistic on the one hand, or I'm more chastened, knowing, a longer view here. On the other hand, I'm seeing what you're seeing too. Absolutely. And survey data is bearing that out right now, that on issues, particularly on LGBTQ issues, on immigration, that, this younger generation of white evangelicals, they are not holding to the values of the older generations. That seems real. I have kids in that same age bracket too. And what you're saying absolutely describes my own kids too. They're growing up in a different world. I teach at a Christian university. I have seen a dramatic change in the students that come into my classroom over just the last 5 to 7 years. I used to be able, I teach on gender and sexuality, and I used to really have to start, very basic and, gender as a social construction and sexuality. Let's, unpack this. And now, they're way ahead of that.
Right.
I have to walk them back sometimes.
Right.
And, I have to take a whole different approach to teaching because, there has been a sea change, I think. So I'm not sure where things are going next. Institutionally, I am seeing still very little change on an individual level, especially among younger Christians. I see enormous change. So I think we're in a very unstable time right now. I'm not sure what's going to happen next.
Yeah, gosh, that's interesting. That's super interesting. So my kids are actually they've like expressed gratitude because they live in the Bible Belt, so they're exposed to very conservative thinking. They also are in somewhat of, it's a public school, but a school of the arts. There's a lot of liberal people there. But it's interesting because at their school in Charleston, School of the Arts, if you're conservatively minded, then you are not the norm.
Yes.
You're the one that everybody looks at and just like, gosh, that's kind of weird. But my kids are thankful that their mom and dad, even though they're a part of evangelical circles where it's the norm to think being gay is a sin, they're like, man, we're actually happy that you guys don't feel that way. But one thing that we have really tried to, like, the one thing that I don't like about the youngsters, but I feel like I sound so old calling them youngsters, but like the pendulum has swung so hard. I understand that cancel culture has its place in some territory, but I think that's the part that I hope comes in just a little bit, because I want my girls, for example, they're the older ones, I want them to understand that, hey, there's a lot of Christian people that they're they sincerely love gay people. They are sincerely not homophobic. They're not freaked out. They're not grossed out. They're not weirded out. And they just think that it's not supposed to be that way because they're trying to honor God's word. It's like I want them to think a little broader than, if they think that that's a sin, then they hate gay people. And I think that's the part of the cancel culture that I don't like. It's like it's allowing them not to be critical thinkers.
Yeah, I definitely think, I'm not sure if there's declining space for these conversations. That's what I was going to say. But here too, historian perspective, cancel culture. So many people, particularly in Christian circles, have been canceled right before we had the term cancel culture, particularly those who have crossed the line on LGBTQ, right, on sexuality, on gender, orthodoxies, in these spaces. So I'm a little less alarmed at our, contemporary presentation of, quote unquote, cancel culture. At the same time, I am seeing just an increasingly difficult situation to have the conversations that we need to be having in the church. And I have the luxury of being a college professor. And so I get to have those conversations every single day with my students, right? But we get to have the conversations, not just, here's what I think. Well, here's what I think. And that's not super helpful. I get to assign reading. I get to, I get to say, let's sit with this. Let's really understand the complexity. And there's a space for that still it's rare. It's very rare. Even in many Christian universities, the majority, you can't have these conversations. I happen to teach at one where I can. But it's, you're right. There's a danger right now to just closing down the conversations. That said, I also need to say I am white, middle class, heterosexual, married, mother of 3 kids. Right. So that's where I am. So I can engage these conversations in a way that I have the luxury. It could be almost, theoretical. There are other people who are not, in this privileged space for whom, ideas about sexual orientation, about LGBTQ rights are not in any way an abstract theory. It is, are you welcome in this church community? I mean, talk about cancel culture. I recorded a podcast a couple months ago. And then, about Jesus and John Wayne, we didn't even talk about sexuality. We didn't talk about same-sex anything. But a couple of weeks later, I got an email from the guy who had interviewed me and said, "Oh, by the way, what's your view on LGBTQ? Specifically, do you think gay people can be, quote unquote, in Christ?" I was like, "Oh yeah, that's easy. Sure. Yeah, they can." And he's like, "Well, that's a problem. And it leads me to doubt whether or not you can even be in Christ." Right. So that's where, and it was really helpful for me to confront that, because even by association and by refusing to deny that another individual, because of their sexual orientation, could be in Christ, that now I was not in Christ. And so they scuttled the whole interview and never aired it. Right. Because
Are you serious?
Oh yes, because my thoughts on anything were now illegitimate. And I'm in the privileged space of, these are just my thoughts. This isn't my identity. This isn't who I am. And so, I just want to, bracket all of this conversation with that reality. And that was just a tiny glimpse that I had of what it must be to walk through life, to try to live in this country and to try to be in Christian spaces when you have to continually battle for your right to even be there.
Gosh, they didn't even air it.
No.
Well, what's so crazy too is, oh my gosh, I hate making this comparison because I'm on the affirming side, and I always want to say this to my listeners. As you're saying that, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous, and that was me 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I was too. And I would probably second guess your faith if I knew you were gay affirming. That's just how I was raised. But it's interesting. It's like, can you not, so I actually had a local pastor. It's interesting how people find me sometimes. He said, I'm super evangelical, super fundamentalist. He said, I've been listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. I was doing some Googling, and then I stumbled on Pastor with No Answers, your episode with Tony Jones, and then I just started listening to some of your episodes, and he literally, knowing how I felt about certain things, he said that he had some people from his Charleston congregation start going to the church I was a part of, and he was legit concerned, and he wanted to know exactly where I stood. His sweet, dear man. I mean, wasn't a jerk. He wasn't trying to be super confrontational. He's trying to be a shepherd. But what was really cool is we had a conversation, and it forced him to think. It forced him, because I told him, I was like, look, let's just assume being gay is a sin. I was like, have you ever been convicted? While you were a Christian, have you ever been convicted of something that you've been doing for 10 years and you didn't even realize how selfish you are, or you didn't realize how belittling you were to your wife? You were a Christian, but you had no, and I was just like, because I think he had that same mentality. It's like, how can a gay person be a Christian? But just those, that's just, I hate that, that I used to be that way. So have you ever been in a conversation with someone and you're like, look, this bullshit Christian nation stuff, and I love America. I love the diversity, but we initially started with consumerism, selfishness, who gives a damn about the Native Americans, and then we've got our dark history of slavery and, civil rights. It just, have you ever pointed that out to someone and they still push back on this is a Christian nation?
Oh, yeah.
And if so, what is their what's their evidence? Because I would say, yes, we were founded on the religion of Christianity, and the religion of Christianity sucks. Like it has a really bad history. Now, if you want to talk the heart of Christianity, no way.
Yeah.
Stop it.
Yeah.
That's not it.
Yeah.
Like, what is people's pushback there?
Yeah. Well, you just have to understand, as you well know, that people have just consumed this mythical notion of Christian America now for generations. This is ubiquitous in conservative evangelical spaces. It's on the shelves at Hobby Lobby. It's in, Christian school textbooks, homeschool textbooks. It's in, David Barton. It permeates Christian radio, Christian television. It is everywhere. So again, this is just truth as far as many people are concerned. So you have to walk into these conversations knowing that, there is a lot of religious formation that has happened, before now. And then you're going to try to, challenge it in a conversation. So that usually doesn't go all that well. I also know that Christian historians have been actively pushing back against this mythologizing of Christian America for decades now, since the 1970s at least. And, and I signed some of these older texts, and they are remarkable. And it is so depressing because they are still absolutely relevant today, which suggests they kind of failed back in 1980 when they were trying to fight against this. And these are texts too. I'm thinking of one in particular, but called The Search for Christian America by George Marsden, Mark Knoll, and Nathan Hatch. And they're very clear. They identify as conservative evangelicals. They are anti-abortion, and they are, they check all those boxes, but they're like, hey, we're also historians. And what does it mean when you say it's a Christian nation? Do you mean that the nation that was living according to the ideals in the scriptures? Well, let's look at that, and let's look at Native Americans, and let's look at enslaved people, and let's look at and of course we weren't. And Christians at any given point never thought their society was perfectly godly, right? They're always fighting against the evil out there, and so it really is a myth. It's a powerful myth. And
that was kind of birthed in the 70s. So pre-70s, we weren't intoxicated with this American nationalism like we are now.
You can find expressions of this throughout American history in Christian spaces. You can find progressive Christians who embrace this kind of Christian America and used it towards different ends. You can still find that, like there again, if you look to history, you can find different moments where you say, aha, see, but it really did come to the fore in the 1970s. I mean, still already in the 40s, 50s, right? Cold War, we are, God's chosen people. We have to defend Christian America, all of that. But then in the 1970s, that's when you have this kind of backlash where you have, the Vietnam War. A lot of Americans are questioning American greatness and American goodness because they're seeing what's happening. And this whole Cold War, we're the good guys, was kind of falling apart when you take a look at Vietnam. And we saw what our military was doing. It was impossible to ignore. And then you also had the bicentennial in 1976. That's actually the year I was born. I was always very proud of that in a patriotic kind of way. I was a bicentennial baby. That was really formative for a lot of conservative evangelicals too. And that's when you see a lot of this Christian America rhetoric, and kind of God bless America Bibles produced and stuff. And we're still very much in that moment. So it's hard to deconstruct this. I will say, you opened by saying that you love America. And that's something I really do push back. This narrative that because you're going to be critical of American history doesn't mean you don't love your country. It can mean the opposite. And, I'm a Calvinist, so I'm very comfortable with human failing and with the nations failing. And if you believe that America, if you insist that America was and is a Christian nation, you lose your place to have a prophetic critique. There is no space for that. And I think that's what we as Christians are called to give.
You just threw me and all of our listeners for a loop. You're a Calvinist. You're complicated. Oh my gosh.
I know, it's so funny.
Awesome.
That's like my coming out moment, right? Most controversial thing I can say is, I'm a Calvinist. I teach at Calvin University. So
Yep. All right. So I got three last questions, and some of them would probably merit longer conversations, and I know we don't have that time. But first question is, historically, just how impactful was Wild at Heart by John Eldredge?
Yeah, it was,
because that's a big time book.
It was sold more than 4 million copies. I tell that my editor, who's completely from outside the world of Christian publishing, like absolutely, he's like, yeah, no way. Get the right numbers, check these numbers, and then he came back. He's like, oh yeah, those are right. So it's astounding. It's astounding the numbers that we're talking about here. I grew up, in that era. It was everywhere. Every Christian guy I knew was reading that. And most of the Christian women I knew were reading that as well. It's hard to overstate its significance in just framing the conversation going forward. Right. But I will also say it did not come out of nowhere, right? That's what I situated in my book. Like, this was part of a much longer history. It just appeared at just the right moment. The book was on the shelves just months before 9/11. And that meant that this message of, God is warrior and men are made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight. That just suddenly had this deep and profound resonance within American evangelicalism.
Doesn't he even use the word barbarian? I read it once long ago, but I think there
is a lot there, right? And then how do you assess the influence? Because a lot of people, initially, I didn't read it until it was out for 3 or 4 years. I heard all about it and I just kind of rolled my eyes. Not my thing, right? I'm just going to stay away. You just kind of laugh it off a little bit until, as a researcher, I finally, my students told me, Professor Dumais, you have to read this book. And so I did. I was like, oh, wow. There is a lot going. And if this is, again, where do religious values get formed? Is it, by reading theological treatises? Who does that today? Is it by listening to Sunday sermons? Well, what is your pastor reading for his or her spiritual formation? And so we really have to take this stuff seriously. So yes, very significant.
Gotcha. All right. Part 2 of my last 3 questions. How long do you think it'll be until we have a woman president?
Oh my gosh. I don't know.
No idea.
Part of me suspects the first female president is going to be Republican.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Why? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Why do you think
that? There is a place for female leadership within conservative Republican politics, right? We see the models. Sarah Palin was the first kind of shot across the bow, and we've seen that, and I think that is a way to kind of pull the rug out from under a lot of the kind of opposition that comes towards the Republican Party from liberals. At the same time, I'm going to say, as a historian, I get super nervous trying to predict what's going to happen next week.
Yeah.
Because one thing that history shows us is you never know what's right around the corner, and it will just throw off all of your theories.
Right. Yeah, I mean, absolutely certain until 2 hours into the results that we were going to have our first woman president in 2016. I mean, who would have ever thought that? All right. So is the Billy Graham rule completely bullshit, or is there some good out of it? We've done a whole episode on the Billy Graham rule, and I actually see some good, but I would lean on the side of it's just not a really good thing.
It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. Yeah. There is some common sense. There is some for couples to put up some sorts of guardrails. I mean, I think that's just normal. I think that it's a good idea. So the Billy Graham rule itself, it's so problematic in part because of the assumptions it's making, right? That a man and a woman cannot be in the same space without either her seducing him being absolutely unable to control himself, or, what I hear often in defense of it is to protect the reputation of the man, because just so many of us women are just waiting to make a false accusation, right? These assumptions. And honestly, as a woman, I've had this applied to me, where I move in different spaces, sometimes, often in non-evangelical spaces, and you can work with colleagues, you can, share a ride to the airport, you can do these things and it's just fun. And then all of a sudden in evangelical spaces, when this is kind of, you can tell it's at play, it makes you feel awful. Like, it's extremely uncomfortable. Like all of a sudden you have to oh, wait, are you seeing me in that way? Oh, wait, do you think I'm seeing you in that way? And so the ability to be professional adults who respect each other, who engage in ways that are not sexual and don't want to be sexual, there's no space for that. And that is really damaging, let alone the whole power dynamics, right? In terms of access, in terms of who gets to have conversations with who is just iced out of all of these. So, there's a space on a personal level. And I think particularly if you find yourself in a position of power, somebody like Billy Graham did, traveling, anything like that, you can come up with some of your own guidelines. But to never be in a public restaurant meeting for lunch or coffee with somebody of the opposite sex. That's not cool.
Yeah. And that just shows how, even with my progressive lenses, how evangelicalized I am, because I think I would still be uncomfortable. I'm trying to work against those tendencies, but seriously, I'd be like, oh my gosh, who's seeing me and all of that. So obviously people know about Jesus and John Wayne, and we'll wrap it here. Tell people what they can expect from A New Gospel for Women, because that seems like an interesting too.
Yeah, A New Gospel for Women, that was my first book, and it is a history of Christian feminism, not just saying, hey, you can be a Christian and a feminist, which is true, but historically also why it has become so difficult to be both Christian and feminist. And so it's a story of an ardent Christian woman who identified as fundamentalist during the modernist controversies, who nevertheless wrote a radical feminist theology that just absolutely blew my mind. And so part of the project is just bringing her story, bringing her theology into the present.
Awesome. Were there any other men's names that were on the table as a potential of the title, like Jesus and Sylvester Stallone?
Yeah.
Or...
What I really wanted was Jesus and Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. It didn't just, it didn't quite have the same effect. But that's really, I was trying to figure out a way to get that in there. So Jesus and John Wayne it was.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on the influence that you're making. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Guys, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure you did. What's not to enjoy with Mrs. Dumais? If you look in the show notes, you'll see where to connect with her, how to become a patron. If you don't want to be a patron, maybe go leave me a review. If you don't want to go leave me a review, then screw you and go to hell. I'm just kidding, but I'm kind of not. It's just a saying for me because I don't really think that there is such a place. So I also want to let you know there's a Pastor with No Answers discussion page. Click on that link. Would love for you to chime in. Last but not least, we got a guy coming on next week. His name's James Wellman. He was not a big mega church advocate in any way, but he wanted to do some research on mega churches. And so he wrote the book High on God, How Megachurches Won the Heart of America. And guess what? It's a very favorable assessment. It will be an interesting one. Love you guys. Have a good week. Maybe tomorrow.